Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. And this is a special episode. I have with me Pranjul Bhandari, who's the chief economist for India and Indonesia for HSBC, and one of the most prominent voices on the Indian economy. I've been tracking what she's been writing for many years, and it's been very insightful reading her research reports to understand what's happening in the mechanics of the Indian economy. And this is a year-end episode. We are, closing out on 2022, and the next year beckons. And actually, I was just seeing a cartoon where people are very hesitatingly trying to open 2023 because of the shocks that everybody's got in in the past few years. So the idea is to, in this episode, is to look back at our economy this year and also look forward where we are placed and what lies ahead. So thank you, Pranjul, first of all, for being part of the show. And let me begin by asking you that, we just recently had the GDP data for the second quarter for the current financial year come out, and it seems that we are broadly on target for a 7% growth this year, and we grew at almost 9% last financial year. On paper, this looks like very good growth, especially in a global context where many economies are facing recession or are likely to face recessions in the coming quarters. But for India itself, how do you sort of see the economy when you look internally and see what's happening in the economy?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me. Secondly, thank you for this kind introduction that you've given to me. So great to be here talking to you and all your viewers. Look, we have bounced back from the pandemic lows, and all of the numbers you cited sound very impressive. But I would caution a little bit here. I would say that don't really go with these numbers because any year-on-year number depends on how good or bad the base is. And the base is all over the place, right? Like we had the Delta wave, we had the Omicron wave, before all of that, we had the first wave. So the base has become really messed up, and the year-on-year number does not really carry very much meaning. The way I like to look at it is that let's take the latest number, September of this year, and then September of 2019, which is a clean pre-pandemic quarter. And if you do the year-on-year of those, it's actually 8% growth over 3 years, which is not great at all. Remember, we were a country 15 years ago, we used to talk about 8% growth per year. Right now, we're talking about 8% growth over 3 years. So that is not great, So we have to think about it from that lens. Look, we have bounced back from pandemic lows, and there have been a few drivers of growth which have been quite outstanding. And I think one of them has been exports. In that same period, 2019 to 2022, when I said GDP grew 8%, exports actually grew 25%. Very strong exports growth. We got lucky, or maybe we were able, that what the world needed during the pandemic, things like IT services, mobile handsets, medicines, drugs and pharma, are the three things we were really able to ramp up production, and our exports really took off. So that has been positive. The second positivity has been that after we got locked at home for so long, we came out raring to spend, taking that holiday this year, taking that double holiday, going out and eating, because we hadn't done that for 2 years. And that pent-up demand was also a strong driver of growth in the last couple of months. And then finally, there was a little bit of capex in the system, for those people like me who track cement, steel, diesel consumption, like all of these sort of like metals and inputs into capex. We saw some of those increases come back in, and we'll discuss later why it's coming. But that also came in, and I think all of this together made for a decent bounce back in the last couple of quarters. But my worry is that going ahead, each of these could become a little unsupportive. We are seeing globally that trade is beginning to slow. Our export volumes have also begun to fall. It's not our fault. It's all the sort of global happenings around the world that trade volumes have begun to slow. And because exports was so important for us last few quarters, that if it begins to soften, it could also soften growth. Then there is pent-up consumption. We enjoyed it while it lasted, but it has an expiry date. It does run its course, and we're already seeing that. In fact, let me just say this point. all of us, we had huge amount of financial savings into the pandemic, or at least most of us. We had nowhere to spend our money. They were just accumulated in our banks. But once we started spending, we spent so much that today our savings in the banks are much lower than pre-pandemic levels. So we don't have the savings firepower to really support consumption for long periods. That's a second. And the third is fiscal. The government really wants to bring down the fiscal deficit. And if it does that by cutting expenditure, then, that is also not supportive of growth. So for all of these things, recovery has been strong in the last couple of quarters, but going ahead, it could sort of fade a little bit.
Now, I wanted to sort of go deeper into each of these factors that you mentioned. One is the private consumption that you talked about, the pent-up demand. And I want to look back. Viewers should also remember that, since 2017-18, India's economies had sort of been decelerating in terms of the growth rate. And in fact, just before the pandemic, we were growing at a very small, very slow rate, less than 4%. So, first, I want to understand is that, this personal consumption demand, which is sort of the biggest engine, as it were, of creating demand in the economy. How do you sort of look at that? You've said that it's sort of tapering down, but over a longer period, is this now in worrying territory, or is this par for the course everywhere it has happened, and we will eventually recover in, say, next financial year or next to next financial year?
Yeah. So look, we have such a large population, and a lot of people associate India's growth with very strong domestic demand. But as I mentioned, exports grew faster than private consumption over the last 3 years. So actually, private consumption was not as strong as people think. Let me just put you some numbers. In the last 3 years, exports have gone up 25%. Private consumption has gone up 11%. So private consumption was not as fast as exports. That's sort of like one important point. Second important point is that, we have a lot of consumer sentiments data we track, like how is a consumer really feeling about his income, about his prospects. And while they have really improved from pandemic lows, they are still below where they were about 5-6 years ago. So the consumer is not feeling as happy as he was about 5-6 years ago. And these things, it's not just a function of what you're spending today, but your ability to spend in the future. If you think that, over time, your wages are not going to really increase too much, then you just don't feel that buoyant. And that is what the consumer sentiments data is really capturing. Then there is one small point that the goods that we are consuming, consumers like you and me, unfortunately, more are imported than produced domestically. So we've seen imports of consumer goods far outstrip domestic production of consumer goods. And that is interesting, because had we consumed more of what we produced ourselves, then somebody would have got a job on the back of that. That person would have had an income which would have created even more demand. So we are letting some of our growth impulse spill over, abroad.
Why is that happening, by the way? Any understanding on that? Why?
Yeah, like if you look where our consumer imports are really high and rising, it's a lot of the white goods. All these things we buy in Diwali, and we sort of say, wow, retail sales are so high, air conditioner, fridge, televisions. If you peer into it, most of them, a majority of them are imported. And I'm really calling out, there are many other goods, I'm sure, but I'm really calling out white goods, because that is one area in which we have become huge importers, and it's just rising and rising, every single year. We really need manufacturing there to sort of bounce back up. Okay. So, there is this idea. And then the last part is savings. As I had mentioned earlier, that, we've really eaten into a lot of our savings. And today savings are below pre-pandemic levels. So, maybe they won't really support us in the next couple of quarters. Look, I don't want to sound all negative. We are going to go in for a soft patch, but honestly, every country in the world is going to go into a soft patch. What India needs to bounce back from this soft patch is investment. It's really investment, because for an emerging market, investment, capex, call it anything, is the only way you increase the production capacity of your economy. And when you do that, then new jobs are created, higher wages are created, and more consumption is created. So anything that increases India's investment rate will be great, for supporting consumption over long periods.
Okay, so this is a very astute point, and I'll come back to the white goods question later on. But I wanted to just link with the investments issue, because again, this is the second big engine of growth for us, and as you mentioned, this is the place where sustainability is an issue, and it can actually give us sustainable growth. Now, we've had corporate tax cut, and we've had the PLI scheme, but more recently, we saw the finance minister also getting slightly exasperated, saying, why aren't corporates um, investing more? Investment numbers per se looked decent in comparison to other things that were happening when we looked at the GDP data. But where is this investment growth coming from on numbers part, and why is there still worry on the investments bit, despite all these reforms?
Okay, look, it's a great question, and I'm so happy you asked it because I have just the exact answer for it. It looks like a puzzle that when you look at cement data, steel data, it's all looking up. And then on the other hand, as you mentioned, there are complaints by many people that, hey, there's no new investment cycle. What's really happening is that we are seeing some capex activity, but it is not a new investment cycle. It is bunched up replacement capex. You call it depreciation, you call it wear and tear. Basically, corporate India every year does some amount of capex just to maintain its machinery, maintain its sort of building, and that did not happen over the pandemic period for about 2 to 3 years. And this year it all got lumped up. And it sort of almost fooled you. It made you feel like it's a new investment cycle. But when you peered into the real indicators of new investment cycle, you saw it was not a new investment cycle. It was replacement demand. I have a way to test this hypothesis. We get investment data as a gross investment, which is the data you spoke about. But with a lag, we also get something called net investment. And the difference between the two is replacement capex. Pull that data out if you want, just chart it. It comes in cycles. We are in an upcycle, and it's a very exaggerated upcycle because few years of replacement capex has got bunched up. So that is one part of the answer. The second is, when do you see the new investment cycle, right? You really want to see it, as we spoke, that really supports consumption over time. There are some good things out there. Everything is not negative. Today, many of our balance sheets are much more positive than they've been in the last 15 years. Corporate balance sheets, bank balance sheets, corporates have shed debt. Banks have not seen NPLs rise as many had feared. These are really important inputs into a new investment cycle. The only problem it's not happening yet is because there's too much of macro uncertainty out there. Commodity prices are so volatile, inflation is volatile, it's high, it's hard to predict growth with certainty. Where will it be in the next year or two? In this kind of macro uncertain environment, investment doesn't generally capex. My hope is once commodity prices stabilize, global growth stabilizes, our own growth stabilizes, I do believe that a new investment cycle will rise.
Okay, so you partly answered one of the questions that I had on inflation, but we'll ask that on how it sort of impacts the uncertainty bit and how it impacts growth. But I wanted to come back to the exports question. I must tell viewers, one of the best things that I read on exports was your paper, I think in 2016, where you sort of broke it down to how much of our exports is lagging because of maybe the currency not being weak enough, or how much of it is from global demand and how much of it is by domestic factors. And the salient point you perhaps made was domestic reform is the central thing that we need to do to improve our exports. This was in 2016, I believe. And since then, now, the rupee is much weaker from that perspective, perhaps. But the global demand has sort of is going through a bad phase. What is your outlook then for India's exports? Because typically all high growth phases saw exports leading us.
Yeah. So look, thanks for bringing that paper up. As in that, we just found that there were like three very important drivers of exports. One is the domestic, business environment. The second is world growth, and the third is a competitive rupee. And I think all three matter. Interestingly, what we found, you said that report was in 2016. What we saw 2 years later was that something changed in 2017. These three things I spoke about were driving exports, but there was something else driving exports too, and we did it very carefully. We did it econometrically. And our sense is that this new thing that became an important determinant of export growth was this rejig of supply chains around the world. We saw that particularly in some high-tech exports, India started to gain global market share. As my sense is as some supply chains got rejigged, around the world. And these are like a few sectors like IT services, which was predominant. Then there was mobile handsets. There was drugs and pharmaceutical, some specialized machinery, automobile parts. I think these were some high-tech sectors where India started doing very well. The sort of flip side to that excitement is that we didn't see the same thing unfold for low tech and medium tech exports, and which is unfortunate because those are the ones which create jobs, and those didn't do as well. But the good news is that high tech exports really gain market share. And my sense is that even if the world goes into a whole deglobalization sort of phase, my sense is that India can still, on the margin, gain a little bit. Maybe a bigger pie of a bigger share of the pie as global supply chains rejig further. And then we have our own area of comparative advantage, which is software services. It started off with call centers 2 decades ago, but it has gone a long way since that. Today, where India really has a huge edge is this thing called global capability centers, where not only do we provide software solutions, we also are an area for research and development and also for chip design. Many MNCs have started setting shop in India for their sort of global, GCC work. In fact, some data, NASSCOM said that in 2020, India had like 1,400 MNCs set up their GCCs in India. In the next couple of years, that number is likely to rise to 2,000. India today has 45% of the world's global capability center business. So it's an area which is doing very well. I'll give you one more quick example. AstraZeneca, when it wanted to make that vaccine, which became a very important vaccine in the pandemic, it tied hands with a company in India, SII, right? And after that, that experience went well. So AstraZeneca has also created its main global capability center in India. So many MNCs are sort of coming into India, and a nice hub is getting created. So my sense is even if some deglobalization happens in trade, there are a few areas, particularly services, where India can still gain a lot.
Okay, next what I wanted to ask you was inflation. Inflation has been a bit of a concern, more than a bit of a concern in the recent past. Since the start of 2022, it has stayed outside RBI's comfort zone. But if you look back more broadly, since late 2019, frankly, there have been only few months when inflation actually hit the 4% target level that RBI has. And it looks like we are not likely to hit the 4% level anytime soon, maybe another year or so. So two things. One, how much is that a concern when you look at India? And secondly, how does it sort of play into the growth dynamics? You've mentioned that inflation being high tends to keep uncertainty high. If you could just reflect a bit on that.
Yeah, great question again. Look, when RBI tried to institutionalize inflation targeting, they worked very hard to come out with a number, like what kind of inflation should India live with? And with their sort of expansive work, they came up with 4%, that an inflation that is higher than that plays havoc with decisions that consumers we make, with corporates make, and is bad for growth. And anything lower than that, doesn't really help growth in any way. So in a way, 4 became like this, ideal sort of number. But, I won't really blame RBI for what's happened in the last couple of years. We've been in the midst of a, global crisis. Supply side shocks of all kinds have sort of all come together. And, the fact that we've been higher than 4% for the last couple of years is something probably almost every country, has had to go through. So I'm not going to blame anybody for that. Rather, I think I'm going to focus on the outlook. My sense is inflation is going to come off over the next year. So from this year, around 6.7% level to around 5.5%. So it is going to come off, and I think that is good. But what bothers me is that my problem is that most of the disinflation that we are going to see over the next year is going to be because of food prices coming off. And the player here is the government. This government, I think, does a very good job in the supply side of food, selling, buying, importing, exporting, sometimes restricting exports, which we can argue later can be good or bad. But what it ends up doing is keeping, food inflation low. And next year being a pre-election year, my sense is they're going to work this machinery at its optimal. So my sense is food inflation will be our biggest sort of driver of disinflation. So that's good, but in a way that also bothers me. It bothers me because there's this one other part of inflation called core inflation. It's X fuel, X food inflation, which is, all the other things you buy, like your clothes, your houses, your cars, everything else. And that inflation is very high. In a way, RBI is in charge of that inflation. And RBI has been raising rates a lot over the last couple of months. But that inflation, core inflation, remains very high and sticky. And that is a worry for me. That is really a worry for me, because if you're going to only focus on food inflation, then honestly, if you get two back-to-back bad climate events, like we already had heat wave in March, things like that, then there's only so much the government can do. So, you can bring inflation down, but it'll always be a little vulnerable. And you're always living on that hope monsoons are good, hope there's no heat wave. So that is my sort of problem, that inflation is likely to come off, but more because of food and not because of core inflation. I'll take one more minute to sort of explain why I think core inflation is so high. Why is RBI not being able to bring down core inflation? My sense is through the pandemic, the structure of our industry has changed. Small and informal firms have lost market share, they've died out to some extent, and large firms have gotten larger, by picking up more market share. Think of a biscuit manufacturer. Earlier we had all of these local biscuits factories. Many of them shut shop. And then some of the giant biscuit manufacturers became even bigger and got national market share. What happens when large firms get larger is that they gain pricing power. They increase prices very quickly, but they don't really cut prices. And that's something which keeps your core inflation high for longer. So this is something which I would say is even away from RBI's sort of control. It's the industrial structure which has changed through the pandemic.
Right. That's a very salient point about how sort of that K-shaped recovery or the change in the structure of our manufacturing or market could have implications for inflation. And that's a fantastic point to understand for the viewers. Now, I want to move to something that generally doesn't get as much attention in India as perhaps we see in the debates outside. When we listen to the US Fed, always the discussion is between containing inflation and having a desirable level of unemployment. But even in most other developed countries, the trade-off is between inflation and employment. Whereas in India, we are largely focused on inflation and growth. And I could perhaps surmise that, maybe growth is the fundamental thing for us and so central for us that we must think of growth. But we also have, even by government official data, fairly high levels of unemployment. If we go to CMIE numbers, even scarier. So, and this is something that when we talk to people from outside also, they also concerned, how is it that so many openly unemployed people in the country? And how does that not come into the policy framework? So I wanted to understand, why does it happen in general that unemployment doesn't get into the policy talk or even decision making, and secondly, how it might be impacting many of these growth metrics. And more recently, we've heard even people from the ruling party or from RSS making a point about this unemployment issue. So I think there is growing concern now that unemployment is an issue. So those two questions: why is it generally sort of skipped, and what are the implications?
Yeah, my sense is that for long periods we didn't have very good labor force data, or like very frequent labor force data, and for that reason we never really spoke so much about labor force dynamics when we were thinking about monetary policy, something that the Fed does a lot. I also think that that's changing, as in CMI came out with its own data, but now we also have National Statistics Office also coming out with like more frequent PLFS data. So I think some of that is now getting rectified. But what we have gotten used to now is substituting a lot of employment data with growth data. So whenever we want to actually talk about jobs, we actually talk about growth with the assumption that whenever you will see growth for long periods, they will culminate into higher jobs and higher wages. So I think that has sort of become the norm. And if you look at RBI's mandate is 4% inflation target, with plus minus 2%, but with an eye on growth and financial stability. So growth has sort of entered that RBI's objective also. In fact, the RBI governor has been very open about this through the last couple of years, that through the pandemic, they wanted to remain supportive of growth as well. And by that, they mean jobs. So I think it has sort of been a part of the work we've done. But where is the outlook for jobs? Look, we'll have to work very hard to create the jobs we need over the next decade. Depending on labor force participation rate, which honestly is a topic in its own right, we may have to, produce 50 to 80 million jobs in the next decade. Both the numbers are very high, 50 million or 80 million. And I'm sort of giving you such a big range because a lot depends on labor force participation rate. Where do these jobs come from? I think, what I call new India, high-tech manufacturing, startups, all businesses on the back of India's new public digital infrastructure, all these exciting things, unicorns, all of these things, they are exciting, but they are not very job intensive. What I call new India today makes up 15% of India's GDP. This is high-tech exports, high-tech manufacturing, and also all the startups. It makes up 15% of India's GDP, employs 5% of India's workforce, right? So we need old India, old manufacturing, agriculture. We need all of that to also ramp up to create the jobs that we need. We feel very disappointed and sullen about the prospects there, but I think something exciting is happening, which is digitization of manufacturing. I'm hoping that in their first avatar, the startups, they focused a lot on e-commerce and services, but I'm hoping that in their second avatar, they will focus on old economy solutions. Agri-tech, it's something that's growing, but it has not come up to scale. Maybe at some point, it sort of reaches critical mass. And then there's digitization of manufacturing, where you take a bunch of small firms and through digitized solution, better access to raw material, better access to export markets, better access to credit via all these new innovations like credit aggregation, better access to logistics using all of these digital innovations like smart logistics. You can make some of these small firms in our country simulate scale, pretend or behave or feel like they are large firms and earning economies of scale. I think if some startups begin to really focus on digitization of manufacturing, we might be able to pull up some of our medium and small scale manufacturing units, which if it happens can be a huge source of jobs. Let's see how this sort of pans out. It's not going to be easy, but if it does, there'll be huge gains in terms of jobs from there.
Right. Okay, now last two questions, and we're trying to wrap up. Looking forward, as you started off from your first answer, where you said, 15 years ago we used to talk about 8%, 9% kind of growth. I remember finance ministers saying that India needs to sort of grow at double-digit growth for 2 decades, at least for us to sort of get rid of our poverty and sort of really achieve anywhere close to our potential. Now, those numbers of what we should grow at or what we could grow at, they've been sliding with a sort of a middling phase in growth. And these days, even 7 or 8% looks a bit of a task to achieve. Going forward next year and next to next year, those numbers are not easily achievable. So has India's potential GDP growth rate, has that taken a hit? How do you sort of see it?
Yeah, I think in the last 15 years, our potential growth has fallen from 7.5% or plus to around 6% on the eve of the pandemic. And I think the biggest driver of that was the fact that India just did not do any investment for like about 10 to 15 years. All the balance sheets were stretched. Corporates had too much debt. Banks had too many NPLs. nobody invested, and therefore we didn't create jobs and wages, and we didn't have growth, right? So that was unfortunate. At this point, we have some new exciting sectors that have grown through the pandemic: high-tech exports, and all the startups, the tech startups on the back of the public digital infrastructure. My sense is if these grow rapidly over the next 5-6 years, we could raise our potential growth from 6 to 6.5. But my sense is 6.5 will not be enough, and it will not be very jobs intensive, because generally things that are high tech use more capital than labor, so they won't be very jobs intensive. For us to get higher growth, job intensive growth, we have to pull up what I call old India, manufacturing, agriculture, and some of the pre-existing services. We have to really pick that up. I hope digitization forms some solutions, but eventually a lot will depend on reforms that the government does. In the last few years, we've seen some exciting reforms like the GST, which is coming to age slowly. We've seen the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We've seen a new RERA, Real Estate Act, which has made that sector a little more transparent. We've seen some good reforms, but this is only the tip of an iceberg. This country needs a lot more. My number one is power sector reforms. Till firms don't get electricity, how will they produce anything? How will they make any jobs? We have to really reform our discoms. We need many more fiscal reforms, especially direct tax code. We need even better ease of doing business. We need some skilling solutions to better skill our labor force. So I think a new avatar, a new sort of generation of reforms will be critical.
Okay, so that brings me very nicely to the last question. I was hoping to ask you, as we look ahead to 2023 and maybe the financial year 2024, you mentioned so many needs for reform, what power is required and everything. Are there any two things that you would say top of, your agenda, two policy changes or two, salutary changes that you would like to see, which can propel India's economic growth? First that, and then two challenges on where you see the threats coming from.
Look, let me answer this very broadly. One is that we obsess a lot about growth, which is good, but we often forget what you need to obsess about growth. You need macroeconomic stability. You need inflation to be low. You need fiscal deficit to be sustainable. You need current account deficit, our trade deficit, to be low. Otherwise, before you know, you have an inflation problem that's culminated into a balance of payment problem. And all of that together has dragged down growth for multiple years. Something we have gone through in our country, at least once every decade. So my number one is that focus on macro stability. When you focus on macro stability, growth comes on its own. We are a very dynamic country which has a lot of sources of growth: demographics, digitization. Preserve macro stability and create a decent stage on which growth can then take off. So that is my number one challenge, that don't over obsess about growth. And my second challenge is don't lose your reform appetite. Like, don't always feel that, I did GST, I did some ease of doing business, I did IBC, we've done reform, stick mark. No, reform is a constant ongoing process. We have to keep doing more and more reforms. We spoke about power and skills and all of that. There's a huge undone agenda even now. So these are the two things. If we can really get these two right, we can soar.
Okay. And two, as I mentioned in the beginning, that people are very, hesitatingly prodding at 2023 and wondering what lies ahead. Every new year seems to be bringing some odd surprise for us. Which are, if any, two challenges that you do not want the economy to face, or surprises?
Yeah. Look, one is, I'm hoping commodity prices and global growth stabilizes. Because honestly, if they don't stabilize, then it's very hard for our country to grow rapidly at a time when commodity prices are all over the place and global growth is just unpredictable. So the global environment has to be far more helpful for us. So that's the one sort of risk. And the second, again, I'm going to come back to this reform thing. If there's a sense that we've done enough and now we need to just sit back and enjoy the gains of what we've done, I think that will be the biggest risk to our growth. Right.
Pranjul, very, very grateful for giving us so generously of your time and insights. Fantastic discussion, and you've made the point you made about old India and what's the potential in old India to sort of create more jobs and perhaps all-round prosperity. As while we must keep pushing on the new India front, is a fantastic point and something that requires reflection by almost everybody. And the fact that we need to keep pushing on reforms, power being one of the central basic things being there. Thanks a lot for your time. And for the viewers, if you like the episode, please press like and subscribe to our channel. And we'll be back next week. Thank you.